Greetings and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast. In tonight's episode, we answer the question, we address the question, have we left it too late to save democracy? And I'm delighted to be once again joined by Dr. David Thunder, who's a previous guest on this show to explore this topic. Now, the creeping erosion of so many of our long-held democratic rights and freedoms is becoming starker and more audacious by the day in a seemingly endless global response to COVID-19. But what can we do about this as individuals? What can we do about this as a society? So we are going to address these issues, particularly off the back of some recent tweets that Dr. David Thunder recently posted, which shared and voiced his own growing concerns, stating that we look on in disbelief as we see the ship of representative democracy begin to sink. Many of us feel sad, helpless and frustrated because we see many of our fellow citizens consumed by fear and propaganda. He's also explored some of the options that he believes are open to us to take back control of our lives, reminding us that a strong and well-organised civil society is a tyrant's worst nightmare, a subject which we will explore this evening. Dr. David Thunder is a researcher and lecturer in moral, political and social philosophy at the University of Navarra's Institute for Culture and Society in Spain. And his research explores the conditions under which human beings can realise a meaningful and flourishing life in a highly complex and interconnected set of social orders. His book, Citizenship and the Pursuit of the Worthy Life, explores some of the ethics of living in a free society and around open democracy and the virtues of citizenship. So he's perfectly placed to help us address these questions tonight. Now, David, welcome back to the Pandemic Podcast. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Dan.
So I want to start by drawing attention to one of your recent tweets, which suggested that a storm is afoot. And in that 2-minute video, in my view, you really encapsulated some of the dominant trends that we're witnessing around the pandemic's response. You know, we're not here to look at the scientific, at least the medical science tonight, but there are other aspects that are playing what seems a pivotal role in the response to COVID-19. And you shared some rather stark warning signs in your video. Would you mind just sharing what you mean when you say a storm is afoot?
Sure. I use the metaphor of a storm because when a storm is gathering, not everybody actually realizes that they're confronted with an imminent storm. But animals are particularly sensitive to this. But if you hear the wind, the temperature drops a little bit, and there are certain somewhat subtle signs that the storm is coming. And in a very similar way, many people may not actually notice when their regime is on the cusp of a major transformation, partly because people tend to rationalize any kind of disruption or change they see in a political regime by saying that it's an emergency measure or that it's temporary or that it'll go away soon. But from my perspective, the kinds of changes we've seen, if they had only lasted, say, a couple of months, then I would have thought, well, maybe it actually was just a blip, like a temporary blip. But there's a trend towards the normalization of highly extraordinary interventions in social life by democratic governments. And what I have in mind is interventions such as, lockdowns, which heavily restrict the mobility of citizens, sometimes even restricting them, at least initially restricting them to their homes. For example, the vaccination passes, which are now being are already in place in Ireland and in France and in several other countries, which basically tell citizens that they cannot go to a restaurant or a cafe without showing medical papers, without showing whether or not they've actually received a specific vaccine. And these kinds of trends towards more control and surveillance by government, also towards a form of responsibility that is enforced by bureaucrats coercively, rather than assumed and exercised freely by citizens, which is what I call collectivization of responsibility. It's the idea that essentially responsibility, we cannot trust citizens to freely exercise their responsibilities. In this particular case, we're talking about in the arena of public health. So instead of telling citizens that when they're sick, they should stay at home, we literally tell citizens, you must stay at home, otherwise the police will send you home. That's a major shift from the old traditional model and liberal model of public health, which was based on advice and voluntary compliance. And so when you take these trends together, and censorship is another important development, very heavy-handed censorship by social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter of any claims that would in any way question official sources. And this is the very antithesis of a free society, because it essentially gives the control to specific elites to be able to decide what kind of information citizens have access to. They become the gatekeepers of information about a range of different issues, in this specific case about health. And that's definitely more like a Chinese model of democracy.
Well, I think the real challenge here, David, is that well, I suppose you may have seen it in your field, looking at the kind of within history. Many of the books that are written about tyranny, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, dictatorships, they speak about these things as primary tools. The state of emergency, the surveillance and clamping down on private choices, this highly collectivized notions of social responsibility, censorship, fear and terror around that kind of state of emergency, and the gradual, and I think it is gradual, this kind of boiling frog piece around rights and liberties slowly eroding, because I think people notice them once they're suddenly swiped. But when they are eroded over a slow period of time, people become accustomed to those micro changes, and before long, people don't realise that their rights have eroded. So it feels like this is somewhat of a turn toward, almost a slow turn towards authoritarianism. This boiling frog. What leads to this being permitted, and why aren't citizens? Why do you think citizens aren't aware of these changes? And well, are they aware of these changes? And if so, why do you think people are tolerating these changes?
I think the reason is because there are certain emotions that tend to shut down rational thought and deliberation, or to be less dramatic, they tend to dull rational deliberation and make it less salient and less dominant. And one of those emotions is fear. It's quite it's a very instinctual emotion that has to do with self-preservation and the confrontation of threat. And when you are confronted with what you perceive to be a very serious threat, you can become quite desperate, and you can cling to whatever solution another person presents you with. And so at the very beginning of this pandemic, we were presented with a series of what you could call worst case scenarios, in which literally it was going to be a plague that would be just ripping through society and killing an extraordinarily high number of men, women, and children. This kind of narrative that took hold very early on and was reinforced by scenes from China and also from Italy. I think that set the pace, so to speak, and it set the tone for the way in which people thought about and reasoned about the pandemic. And so from very early on, people felt a lot of fear. And this feeling of fear made them much more predisposed to approve extraordinary interventions and emergency measures. And another piece of the puzzle that's actually quite important is that governments, instead of trying to calm that fear, governments actually reinforced that fear in many cases. And for example, one of the subcommittees of SAGE, several of its members were reported, I believe, in the Telegraph or in in one of the British newspapers that they have regrets over deliberately stoking public fears and using techniques to make the public more afraid, so that they'd be more, let's say, compliant. That's not an adult way to treat people. That's treating people as children rather than adults, thinking that they need to be scared in order to expect them to comply with public health rules. And so I think fear has played a major role in disabling people's ability to handle this pandemic in a kind of a moderate and balanced fashion, because there was such a focus from the beginning on all of the evils of COVID, all of the harms of COVID, and very, very little discussion of the harms of lockdown, for example. And so that framework or that narrative focused people's minds simply on the pandemic, on the disease. And as you know, the fear of death is hardwired into us. So when someone presents us with death as an evil and says, well, COVID could kill you, and they repeatedly say that you could be killed by COVID, or your grandmother or your parents, then it's quite normal, that's natural for somebody to react in a defensive manner and to be less receptive, let's say, to the full gamut of evidence.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's played a significant role. The other point that I'm really fascinated to explore more deeply is around this highly collectivized notion of social responsibility, where we have this paternalistic, I've mentioned this several times in recent times on the podcast, this paternalistic style parenting approach, rather, where we almost have solution diktats. You know, like you said at the beginning, individual choices and personal responsibility in many countries have been essentially taken away. You know, there's rare examples like Sweden who have got high levels of trust. Citizens appear to have high levels of trust in their government, and the governments trust their people, and therefore we see very different set of approaches and very different set of outcomes. But here, it's almost like solution diktats under this kind of highly collectivized notions of social responsibility, protecting one another, protecting the NHS, as we've seen here in the UK. What's driving that kind of shift towards that highly collective notion of social responsibility? Is this a trend that we've witnessed prior to the pandemic that's accelerated, do you think?
Well, I think back to, the World Wars. And there is a sense in which when you're on a footing of war, the rationale for hierarchy, for highly top-down forms of management of the problem, for organizing all the resources of a country and harnessing them to a war effort. Probably the two world wars were examples where you did see a highly centralized and top-down conception of, let's say, the political order. And I think what's happened is that elites have painted the pandemic as a warlike situation, and they have exploited that logic of war to rationalize a kind of highly top-down approach to the problem, and of course that's actually deeply problematic. Because in fact, society is extraordinarily complex with many different types of institutions and groups. And it's actually impossible for any government to see what's happening on the ground everywhere simultaneously. They're not omniscient. They're not like gods. And so when they prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution, it's inevitable that they will make major errors and that there will be major collateral damages. And just an example that I brought up in our last discussion has to do with the nursing home situation. It's undoubtedly true that governments badly let down their nursing homes and their elderly citizens. And we might ponder why that happened. And I think part of the reason was because of arrogance, because of the idea that public officials know best. and that they simply dictate to the managers of nursing homes exactly how to do their job, and how to manage the crisis. And the result of that mismanagement of the nursing homes was, of course, a very high number of, a disproportionately high number of deaths in the nursing homes.
Yes.
In Ireland, it's estimated that certainly, probably in the region of maybe 40%, 30 or 40% of the deaths occurred in the nursing homes. And in Spain, similar figures I've seen for Spain and for many other countries. So that's just one example. But I think it has to do with a mentality that just of profound distrust in the ability of citizens to manage a difficult social problem, and to tailor their responses to that problem. So I don't know, you have a business telling all businesses that they need to shut their doors, for example. And maybe it's a business in which there are many young people who work in that business who are not at high risk from COVID. You know that their families depend on their income from that business. The whole business will collapse if it's not kept open, or if it's closed for too long. All those kinds of considerations are considerations citizens need to take into account. But governments didn't allow them to make those kinds of complex and subtle calculations. They simply imposed a one-size-fits-all logic upon everybody. And I think it's insulting towards citizens to do that, in a sense, because it's a distrust both in their intelligence, their ability to actually make good choices, to understand the situation they're in, but also in their good faith. Because the idea that citizens would sort of act maliciously or would endanger public health deliberately, I mean, it's just a lack of trust in citizens.
And what do you think's created that lack of trust? I mean, you've written about the ethics of living within a harmonious society with conscientiously formed ethical commitments to society. But I mean, there's two parts of this really. Firstly, what's led to that lack of trust, or that assumed lack of trust, and then the second part I'd like to explore is the kind of perceived trade-off of individual rights and liberties versus the kind of collectivist ideology. It assumes that they cannot go hand in hand, that there is a trade-off. But firstly, what do you think has led to that kind of lack of trust and taken away the responsibility from individuals?
Well, there are two potential answers to that question. One of those answers I'm more confident about than the other. Let's say the part that I'm more confident about is that the response of elites to ordinary citizens in themselves reflects a lack of trust. And in a sense, trust is not just a phenomenon you just bump into. Trust, it's not something you just find in the world. Trust is a decision. I mean, you can choose to trust somebody or to distrust them. There is an element of choice. And so I think that part of what's led to this distrust is simply a decision by elites not to trust citizens. They were not obliged to make that decision. Nobody forced them to choose to distrust citizens. They could have decided to choose citizens, but they decided not to trust citizens. And then why they made that decision, honestly, I'd have to get in their heads to understand that. I don't know why they chose not to trust citizens. Then there's a second issue, which is more complex, and that's whether or not distrust is somehow, let's say, already at work in the fabric of society. I mean, could it be that, and I say, I'm speculating, this is somewhat speculative what I'm going to say.
Sure.
Is it possible that we have developed a somewhat individualistic way of life, a somewhat consumerist way of life, in which perhaps social capital is not as strong as it was before? Is it possible that perhaps we ordinary citizens have less trust in each other, insofar as neighborhoods are not always as closely knit as they may have been before? And in some cases, there's more mobility and more migration, which doesn't necessarily foster trust, because you have a lot more strangers around you, and you may not be able to establish those very, very strong bonds with your neighbors. So it's possible that people were softened up already by weak social capital, by weak connections with their neighbors, to be more receptive to totalitarian styles of politics. And as I said, this is somewhat speculative, and it does depend on empirical information and investigation of what the state of the social fabric is.
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis and a set of assumptions to explore. You're absolutely right. I think the other part around this piece around trust is this rise of technocracy, where you have experts, elites that think they know best for society. We were discussing the role of big tech prior to the broadcast, and many of these companies and founders think they know how to solve society's problems and therefore pursue a chosen set of solutions. But we've seen the same throughout the pandemic response. It's not limited to the pandemic. But this rise of technocracy has played such a considerable role. How has that been, in your view, how has this become such an enabled component within broader society?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think it has to do with the structure of the modern state, and in particular, relatively centralized states. In which they are structurally centralized. That is to say, the institutions themselves are premised on the idea of a kind of command structure where you have a bureaucracy that is, almost triangular, where you have people at the top who are dictating policies down the line. And so I think a more centralized state tends to foster the operative assumption that any major social problem ought to be solved and solvable by centralized methods, such as technocracy, which basically involves the centralization of knowledge. I mean, technocracy essentially is it's a way of pooling knowledge at the center and then applying that to solve social problems. And of course, that's actually very controversial as an assumption, because there are plenty of philosophers and social theorists and historians who point out that knowledge is necessarily, Hayek is an example, that knowledge is necessarily dispersed. And so there really is no one kind of node in society in which all of the relevant knowledge is centralized. And in fact, many people I think they have this utopian dream that if we just nominate the right experts and get them together in a room, they can solve our problems over a cup of coffee. Or, even if they have to work very hard, and they have to deliberate, to be fair, they probably have to work very hard. But the point is, can they really, is their knowledge adequate to solve such extraordinarily complex problems to do with disease control that manifests itself in so many different ways? So as I say, why that technocracy arose is a historical development that went hand in hand with the rise of the modern state. And something that I write about sometimes is the rise of the concept of sovereignty, which basically sovereignty, what it means is that public authority is pooled and centralized in one institution. Whereas in more feudal and medieval models, not that I'm advocating for them, but just to say that it is a contingent historical development, authority was highly dispersed across many different social entities, public authority, and no single authority really had the final say. Whereas now we have an ideology of sovereignty that says one institution has the responsibility to solve any significant social problem, really, and has the final say over that social problem.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, I would like to unpack that, because actually, on the surface, it does feel like that's how it's been presented, that the governments are that centralized institution responsible for driving this. But in many ways, if you look at the UN, for instance, the UN used to be seen as kind of a multilateral organization where, the heads of state, head of nations would come together and all together work collaboratively on different policy areas or concerns. But increasingly over the last few years, we've seen, rather than multilateralism, we've seen more multi-stakeholderism, where we're seeing a greater involvement of private stakeholders. We've seen it through the pandemic with individuals like Bill Gates playing a significant role in the management of pandemics. The role of technology companies and other big business in playing a significant driving force in the direction. I mean, if you look at vaccine passports and digital digital IDs, it's a multi-billion-dollar or multi-billion-pound industry where clearly there's driving interests amongst these wider stakeholders. And it feels to me, though, we've seen beyond just individual governance, it's whether these wider stakeholders are now playing a greater role than they have done before, almost like they did in that feudalistic time. But again, it's an elite. You know, it's not ordinary people. It's not ordinary business. It's those at the very upper echelons of society that are playing alongside governments. And almost, I would suggest, we're on a path where, in some ways, governments almost feel like they're going to become secondary to the needs of the elite corporations. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there's a lot of people have written about the role of capital and large holders of capital in democracy and the influence of money over democratic governments. And there's a simple fact about democratic governments that maybe some people don't sufficiently attend to, and that is that they are economic operations. They actually require funding. They need to be funded in order to run the institutions, and so they need to enter into partnerships not only with small citizens, ordinary citizens, small businesses. They have a clear strategic interest in forming partnerships with large companies, large investors, and so forth. And of course, they're partly funded by investors who buy, stock, who actually fund their debts as well. So this leads to a problem, which you're pointing to, which is that these major business ventures, their interests can become aligned with democratic governments, but not necessarily aligned with ordinary citizens. There's no reason to assume that the alignment between big capital and government will automatically converge with the interests of ordinary citizens. There's absolutely no reason to believe that. And in science, we've seen I'd have to be careful. I mean, if this was on YouTube, for example, we'd have to be careful, just as a very vivid example, about how we'd even comment on, say, the vaccination issue. If we so much as mentioned some of the serious risks surrounding vaccines, or the reports of adverse events, or if we mentioned, hypothetically, say, ivermectin or some other drug that was showing a lot of promise, this video could be shut down on YouTube. So that tells you how much influence private companies have. But I want to sort of also say, on a more positive note, that I favor public-private partnerships with one caveat, and that is that the private entities, the private companies, should not be just giant multinational companies. They should be small. They should be small and medium businesses that are actually forming partnerships with local governments, to help solve local problems. So really, all of this comes back to the problem of scale. I mean, if you run a government at a national level, and if you concentrate power at the national level, then you're inviting nefarious or at least problematic partnerships with major holders of capital. It's inevitable if you have a highly concentrated, let's say, centralized national government. In a highly federated political system in which local governments have the majority of power, then you have a potential for healthy forms of public-private partnership.
How do you? I know we've gone slightly on a divergent here. This is an important subject, I think. How do you, even in those localized or highly centralized environments, ensure that private financial interests don't dominate um, the kind of political process or the solutions as we've seen that come through in the last 18 months? How do you regulate against that? Because it's very clear that money makes the world go round. How do you protect against excess influence, this idea of philanthrocapitalism, whereby we could end up in this technocratic state where the experts are the ones with the most money? How do you protect against that within the context of a public-private partnership?
Yeah, I mean, one way to do that has to do with competition between governments. So, if you think of citizens as, I mean, it might seem a bit crude to say this, but as consumers of services, and the service has to do with public governance or good governance, then in a highly federated system, the taxes, everything is set at the local level, including taxes. And so when citizens feel they're getting a good value for money, then they will reward their government with loyalty, with more loyalty, and they will reside there and they continue to pay taxes there. Whereas if they perceive that their money is not being made good use of, then many citizens will actually move to an adjacent regime, or they can easily do that if it's the same language, if it's geographically relatively close, and they have an incentive to bring down their taxes to move to another jurisdiction. So there's no way to eliminate corruption and cronyism. I mean, there's really no way to eliminate it. But I think when you diversify a political system and introduce more competition, then citizens can sometimes perceive the effects of cronyism in bad services or inefficient use of their money, and they may be able to act on that. Now, if you're stuck with the centralized system in which for the time being it's not going to be very federated, and certainly the United Kingdom, I think England is a good example of a fairly centralized system, then, I'm kind of anticipating that we're getting onto solutions, but I think education, it's damage limitation. That's really all you could do. It's just damage limitation through education and mobilization of citizens.
Well, absolutely. I think we'll come on to solutions, but it's like one final underscore another point that you've made in your video. This how the emergence of the collectivist ideology assumes that personal freedom and responsibility cannot go hand in hand. We've witnessed that really in the context of everything we've just discussed here. Well, it would be a good pivot point is to ask the question: how do we rekindle the love for liberty, freedoms, rights? Because it feels like under this sense of collective responsibility, people have willingly foregone their individual rights. And there may be during you use the warlike analogy, maybe there's certain a period of time that people would support that. But here we are 18 months on, and the scenes that we see in the likes of Australia, with a complete collapse of civil rights, the rise of a police state, you would have thought this would give anyone just in a free and open society a moment to pause and reflect and ask what is really going on. These countries on a zero COVID path. It's quite, to me, completely shocking. It's shocking to watch. Here we are 18 months on, and this is still happening. But it's not just happening in pockets of developing nations. They're happening in civil democracies. How have we reached this point where individual rights have been so far eroded, but willingly so? And then from there, if we will, we can go into the solutions, look at how we can rekindle the love and support for these things.
Yeah, I think one of the very interesting and disturbing aspects of this pandemic, and specifically of the political responses to the pandemic, is this notion of solidarity and altruism, and the role it's played in rationalizing the surrender of liberty. I mean, basically, people like to feel approved of. They like to feel like they're good people. They're doing the right thing. They care about others, and that feeling, that sentiment, is is a good thing in general, and I think it's a noble sentiment and a noble desire to want to be doing the right thing and caring for other people. But I think it's been terribly exploited and misused. I'd say misused in the sense that good intentions. They say the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Essentially, you know, I could be the most well-intentioned person in the world. I could want to care for other people, and I could authorize, or let's say I could support, just as you saw, large majorities of people were calling for not only were they supporting existing lockdowns, they were actually in opinion polls suggesting we needed more lockdowns and more restrictions. And so in a similar way, altruism, this sense of that I'm a good person and I care about others. I see on Twitter a lot of Australians saying anyone who gets out in the street who protests is more or less saying they're an enemy of the people. They don't care about public health, and the responsible people are staying at home. That's a way of depicting responsibility.
Yes.
But I think there's a profound naivety in the idea that if I hand these extraordinary powers to a human government, to a government of human beings, what are often called emergency powers, basically, right? If I hand these powers over to them to solve a temporary problem, but it's going to be temporary because it will pass, that they'll simply just use those powers just for that problem, and that they won't use those powers to enhance their own position of power, and none of those powers will become normalized or routinized, and none of those powers become institutionalized over time. Now, why would somebody think that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe they have a short historical memory. It might be that they don't know about how fascism, Nazism, and so on, how they came about. They were always responses to emergencies. Nazism, for example, and people hate it when you talk about Nazism because they think that then you're saying, anyone you disagree with is a Nazi, which is ridiculous. And obviously, I'm not saying that. But just as a historical observation, the abuse of power and the institutionalization of this abuse of power that came about under Nazism was obviously a response to an emergency situation in which the German people felt absolutely, that they were being exploited by their opponents, and that they were economically just doing very, very poorly, mass unemployment. And Hitler promised that he would remedy this emergency for them. And so they gave over these powers. And many Germans, I've been reading some books about this, many Germans were absolutely astonished at what he did with those powers. They had no idea he was going to do that. And I think people think now that if you give these extraordinary powers to a government, that they're not going to abuse it. Well, why do you assume that? Why? I mean, you'd have to have a very idealized idea of human nature and think that we're like angels and we're not susceptible to corruption.
I think the other part that stands out for me within that frame of reference is the bystander effect. And right now, we can see these things happening in other parts of the world. We've experienced degrees of this within our own country. We're seeing in France, police walking cafe to cafe, restaurant to restaurant, checking people's medical papers to see if they have their papers in order to access the restaurants. And people can't make those comparisons, but many people are just standing by watching this. Almost, it feels like people are leaving it for someone else to deal with, which comes back to the question, what can we do? What are some of the solutions here? How do we help people appreciate and have gratitude for their rights and liberties, and fall back in love with that sense of freedom that we've had, so that we don't willingly concede them? How do we do that, David?
Yeah. That's a $1 million question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's all I need, David.
Yeah. So, maybe in 2 minutes I can give you the answer to that, and we'll just implement it. Yeah, I suppose I'd start by saying that resistance movements, and here let's talk about a peaceful resistance movement, because I'm not advocating armed rebellion. I don't think we're at that stage, and I think peaceful resistance can actually go a long way, and that's what I advocate. But peaceful resistance, we shouldn't be under the illusion that that happens just because spontaneously lots of ordinary citizens just decide, oh, I'm going to resist the regime and I'm going to get out in the streets. These movements are always spearheaded by leaders. So it's always, just as the government is led by elites, in a very similar way, any resistance movement will be led by a certain kind of elite, you might say, initially, at least people who have the courage to stick their neck out and be in the front line and take a leadership role. So I think the role of leadership cannot be underestimated. I think having the right kinds of leaders, and leaders cannot be just produced, by diktat. Basically, leaders have to arise. They have to choose. They have to make the choice. And so, hopefully, in this video, at least people listening to this will think about what, if any, leadership role they might have in helping to take us out of this crisis. So here's one form of leadership that I think is important. I saw in the comments someone mentioned journalism. I think journalists have a huge role to play. Just as an example, to start with journalists. Journalists educate the public at a certain level. Like they educate the general public who read newspapers or follow Twitter or whatever it might be, or social media. And I think that's just to begin with. Journalists have a role to play, and I think organizers, people who actually organize the protests, do the logistics, help people actually to get out in the streets, set the date, set the time, right? And then a lot of that escapes their control afterwards because they can't control who responds to their invitations necessarily, but they at least set it in motion. But there's a deeper point, a more profound point, which has to do with education. And that is that no matter what kind of regime you live in, ultimately the way a regime controls you and me is there are a number of mechanisms. One has to do with fear. So carrot and the stick, fear and manipulation. So they promise certain things for us. They say they'll take certain things away if we don't behave. And so if we are very susceptible to that kind of manipulation, if we're not willing to make any sacrifices for our principles, if we don't have any courage, then we are prime candidates for this kind of manipulation. And the second way that they control us is by controlling information and education. So if they're able to shape our mind and the content of our mind and what goes into it and how we think, then that is a very useful instrument for a government to be able to control us. So that's why I believe that freedom is inside us. Like, I really do think freedom is in the mind as well. It's real and it's in the mind, because it's how we think, how we process information is what makes us free in the first place. And it's not just an intellectual thing. It's not just, it's also a kind of courage. It's the courage to confront evidence and reality, even if it's uncomfortable. And it's the courage, I think, of the will as well, the courage to, if you like, run risks for things that really matter, to take a risk. Just going to a protest is taking a risk. I mean, it's taking a risk at the most trivial level, that, somebody might see you on TV and think that you're a fanatic. That might be enough to dissuade someone from going to a protest.
Right. I mean, in business, there's a phrase, success is an inside job, which is this exact point, that freedom is an inner mindset. It's a sense of feeling free. And in the context of business, it's a case of, if you work on your inner game, you work on your mindset, how you see yourself and see the world, then you will start to create changes in your outer world. And I think one of the challenges we have here with the kind of inner freedom the inner sense of freedom, is I think that has been compromised by the things that you've spoken about, whether that's control of information, we can call that propaganda, the lockdowns, being isolated, the constant fear-based messaging. It wears people down mentally and emotionally, to the point where that perhaps inner freedom is compromised. So for me, I do see a real need to mentally and emotionally help people restore that inner strength, and that in doing so, the inner resolve to protect that inner freedom as well as the outer freedoms. Would you say that's something that we need to focus on?
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects to this. One is the cultivation of inner freedom, which means taking responsibility for your own life, taking responsibility for your own choices, not being simply dictated by others in your choices, but weighing carefully the advice that you're given, taking seriously the credentials of the people giving that advice, corroborating the advice wherever possible. I think that's got to do with self-responsibility, and I think it's extremely important. But there's another aspect which is external, and that has to do with the people I surround myself with, the kinds of social networks that I get involved in, that I plug into, because I'm going to personalize this and just take my own case, as somebody who was very uneasy about a lot of the things that were being done in the name of public health from the very beginning. Certainly by the summer of the first year of the pandemic. By that summer, I was just absolutely almost despairing of the sorts of heavy-handed measures that were being imposed. Now, I found tremendous support, I have to say, in a number of people I was following on Twitter, who I just found to be. Martin Kulldorff is an example of one of them, who's a Harvard doctor and epidemiologist. And I just found that he combined a lot of common sense with attention to data and attention to evidence, the kind of thing that I really hoped to see in scientists. And I found it in him. Now, he's just one example, but I was following a lot of people. Some were not on Twitter, but I was getting their information forwarded to me through Twitter,
yes.
Even though they're not on Twitter. Professor Bhattacharya is an example. And I think I just felt built up by these people. I felt that they were really filling in gaps in my knowledge and in my understanding. And they were helping me make sense of what was going on. And honestly, if it hadn't been for Twitter, and let's give credit where credit's due to the infrastructure of Twitter,
Yes. Yep.
Just reading newspapers and watching TV, I would have been in a very bad situation, because I would have been exposed to a very, very filtered version of events. And so I encourage people who may be skeptical about social media to just take the dive but just be careful and discerning about who you follow. Also follow people you disagree with, so that you get the other side as well. It's easy to get the other side because mostly it's what we get in the media anyway, the mass media. So it's not as crucial to follow those people because you kind of get it thrown at you all the time. But I think just expanding your information pool carefully, and you gradually get a sense of who is talking sense, who's being honest about the information. It's not an easy process, but I have ended up following an awful lot of people and learning an awful lot from them. So then I try to pass that on in my own tweets, some of that information and understanding.
Indeed. I think, educating oneself credibly and then educating others are very much part of the process of change, I think, is to help to do that. Social media plays a role. But the point you made around building a network of people, I think there's a lot to be said for individual conversations, particularly now. Certainly most parts of the UK we're able to meet in person. I think those individual conversations are really, really important, because otherwise you're behind a screen and it's you can make your comments. But when you actually be able to have that dialogue, I think it's really important. But the other piece is around being around people who also value freedom. I think that's something that's underscored the protest movement. Is it's it's based upon shared values, even where the protest movement itself hasn't had necessarily the most clear, concrete objectives. What it's done is brought people together based upon a set of values, and I think there's so much importance in that, because it shows people that you are not alone. It shows that you are surrounded by people who do respect values, individual rights, as well as having social responsibility. I think you made a very good point earlier on. You know, it's really important to recognise that the majority of human beings do want to do the good by one another and for themselves. And my experience within the protest movement has been that is almost elevated. It's almost that the majority of people I come into contact with within the protest movement want to do the right thing for society. They want to do the right thing for the planet, but they also respect individual freedoms and rights. And I think being part of that kind of protest group, that community, however you want to look at it, is such an important piece.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that just the importance of positivity. I mean, it's so easy to be pessimistic in the world that, as we see it now, as we see events unfolding. And I did say in one of my videos, I did say that things will probably have to get a lot worse before enough people wake up to turn the tide. And I would stand by that statement. I mean, I do think that people will probably have to be shocked, somewhat shocked, more shocked even than now, by what they see, by the level of exclusion and discrimination, and the kind of rhetoric that is being turned against the unvaccinated. I think people will have to be awoken in their humanity to what's going on. But as I say, you know, I do think in the meantime that, let's say, seeing the glass, you know, to use the old cliche, half full, not half empty. I mean, the reality is that the state, with all the control and bureaucracy and technocracy that it has, the state cannot comprehensively control what happens in my home. It simply cannot. What I say to my wife, what I say to the people around me, my friends, when we're in private gatherings, and even semi-public gatherings, the state cannot hyper-regulate all of that successfully. And so there is a space of freedom that remains, communities, neighborhoods, and so on. And I did say in one of my later videos, I did say that you know, a strong and well-organized civil society is a tyrant's worst nightmare, because it's very difficult to penetrate a very well-organized and strong civil society. Now, I agree with. I would say I'm not suggesting that we are sort of that all parts of society, the social fabric, are really very, very strong. It's not necessarily the case. But there are pockets, I think we could say, small communities that can intentionally unite around common values. And so I'm not a determinist. I don't believe society is run like a clock, you know, that it's just you wind it up and whatever happens, happens. I actually believe that the free choices of people are decisive, have a decisive role to play in shaping our future. And so I think people in neighborhoods, people, not necessarily geographic or physical neighborhoods, people are able to connect with colleagues or friends who think, just to have conversations with them and, you know, to explore some of these issues, and even just to get together and have dinner or whatever. I mean, recently I had a lunch with some friends, and everyone was shaking hands, and it was the first time, well, I think, in which in a group people were shaking hands, and I kind of just thought, wow, like I haven't seen this in a long time. But it really brought home to me the fact that we actually do have to take normal life, take it up again. And we have to return to normal, some semblance of normality. And we can only do that by doing it, you know, by example. And my own fears and my own apprehensions were sort of diminished by this situation of where people were more relaxed. And because I've been so propagandized for the last 2 years, honestly, I probably did. A part of me thought, this is just utterly reckless to shake hands with people. Utterly reckless. Part of me thought that. And then another part of me thought, but we've been shaking hands for the past, how many years? How many centuries?
Yes.
And so, I mean, should I really be so afraid of shaking hands with people? Particularly in a place where COVID has already created an awful lot of natural immunity, where practically a huge number of the population has been already vaccinated and so forth. It just doesn't make sense to have this reaction. It's an emotional reaction, not a rational reaction.
It's evidence of the programming. I mean, it's in my gym. We used to have to book a time slot to go in, so it had limited numbers. And I was still in the habit of doing that. I turned up one day and said, I couldn't get into the app to book my slot, and they said, you don't need to do that anymore. I'd become conditioned to book my slot in the gym. It becomes habitual. These patterns based upon, again, what information we're exposed to, and how we then comply with those mandates.
Exactly. And I know that some people watching this will say David Thunder is advocating that everybody, the whole world just shakes hands with everybody else, and that we drop all sorts of restrictions and all sorts of, let's say, measures of prudence. We stop washing our hands and so on. And I just want to clarify that I advocate for prudence. My advocacy is that every individual should assess their situation and make a prudent and informed decision. And sometimes the prudent decision is actually to give someone a hug. And sometimes the prudent decision might be to keep your distance. But what you cannot do is say for a population of, what's the population of the United Kingdom? I actually am blanking, I don't know.
68, 69 million.
Over 60 million people, that from now on, nobody can hug anybody or anybody over such and such an age. There are going to be cases where people just after a certain amount of period of time just say, I want to be with my loved ones. I want to touch my loved ones. I want to be able to give them a hug. And I've waited long enough. And I respect that decision. For me, that's a prudential decision and a life decision that they have to make. I mean, somebody who is quite old and they don't know how long they're going to live for, they could lock themselves away from their loved ones indefinitely, and maybe basically lose the last few years of their life in solitude. Or they might make a rational calculation to say that, well, look, I don't have many years left. It's worth the risk to be with my loved ones. Can I decide that for them? No. Can you? No, you can't. Can the government decide that for them? It can't. And this is what people have to realize. Life is a risk. Living is a risk. We have to make choices every day that are risk-laden. And if you expect that some bureaucrat or some public health expert can tell you how to manage all of the major risks, the important risks in your life, then you are simply deluded.
Well said. What a powerful statement, David. I think that's almost an incredible way to end. But I would like to ask a final question. In account of the title of this episode, have we left it too late to save democracy? What are your beliefs? Do you think we can preserve a free and open society and the principles of democracy? Are you hopeful for the future?
Well, I guess I would say that as far as the institutions of constitutional democracy go, I believe it's likely that they're going to go downhill for some time to come because of the abysmal quality of political leadership that we have at the moment. So I do believe they're probably heading in a bad direction, and I'm not very optimistic that the political institutions are going to be improved anytime soon. But on the positive side, I do believe that there's an incentive now for citizens to organize more effectively and to honor freedom in their small-scale community settings. And there are ways to resist the trend, the drift towards totalitarian politics. And there are tools for resisting. And they include education. We've talked about that. They also include civil disobedience and non-compliance. Because don't forget that any bureaucrat, any tyrant, let's say, because bureaucrats are not tyrants necessarily, but tyrants do use bureaucracy. They do use bureaucracy. They do employ it. And tyrants rely on a supple citizenship. They rely on citizens being very compliant. And I believe that the law is a moral phenomenon. The law is justified by moral principles to serve the public interest. And when the law becomes destructive to citizens' interests, then I believe the law is no longer binding upon us. And I believe that there is a civil or orderly way to register our non-compliance, to refuse to comply with the law, without recourse to violence or disorder, So I think we have the tools to develop a resistance movement, a peaceful resistance movement, and that's why I'm optimistic.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. And I share that optimism with you. I do believe in the power of a free and open society. And I also believe the power is in our hands as citizens to make it so. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and wisdom on this fantastic episode again. For those of you who are watching today, this is our second interview with Dr. David Thunder, who's previously appeared on the Pandemic podcast. If you're a member of our Telegram group, you'll see that we posted the previous interview earlier today. We'll post it in the comments on the various social channels, so you can go back and watch that one as well. But please do share this episode. Fantastic conversation, helps us to spread the word. As we discussed today, education is one of the greatest tools, and I believe conversations like this can help empower people to see the situation in different ways so that they can make informed choices for themselves. So thank you once more to David. And for the rest of you, if you haven't already subscribed to the Pandemic podcast, please just take a moment of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. Join our mailing list so you can get first access to new interviews like this as we bring them to the show. So thank you once more to David, and thank you to everyone who's engaged live throughout this special episode. And I look forward to further episodes again later this week. So good night to everyone, and thank you once again, David.
Thanks. It's been great.